with a sonnet, words are arranged, just as objects are arranged in a still life painting. This painting from 1967 was acquired recently by friends. It was exhibited, as this card indicates, 3 or 4 years ago by the Laurel Tracy Gallery, my gallery in Red Bank, New Jersey. And the kind of comments that I heard virtually universally had to do with, oh, Cézanne. I want to take that up. What I want to take up specifically is the connection that painters have with the past, because by saying Cézanne in the context of our society, it is a pejorative. People might think, oh yes, he's taken up a white tablecloth, fruit, gourds, basket, accoutrements that belong to Cézanne. So this young painter is obviously wandering around and doesn't know what he's doing. Nothing could be further from the truth. This young painter knew what he was doing the way painters know what they are doing, from the inside out, from one painting to the next, not the way intellectuals, art historians, and scholars think, not through ideas, but through paintings. And in point of fact, from 1959, when I left the Art Students League, until 1969, I was going back and forth, exploring aspects that I had learned in the Edwin Dickinson class at the League, now painting softly, now painting more structurally, and one of the aspects led to this particular painting, which is really the climax of, if you will, as a major painting, in size at least, of a group of paintings that are more sharp-edged, and that eventually, after about 1969, came to form my mature style. I was 40 at that time, and I would point out that along with, I think, virtually every painter, American painter in the 20th century, we don't get going until we're in our 40s, because we don't have the kind of training that they had, let's say, in France or even in this country around 1900. We had to work it out for ourselves, whether we were Gorky or not. Now, the question of representation and Cézanne is something that I really want to address, and the kind of prejudice that thinks that a painter is necessarily wandering around if he uses something from the past, because painters have always done that. From ancient times, we don't borrow from one another, we steal. The root of painting for me is lived experience. And for me, it begins in 1940, when at the age of 9, coming to New York where my grandfather lived, my parents took me to the World's Fair and also to the Frick Museum. And when I was in the Frick Museum and saw the Piero della Francesca, especially the Piero della Francesca, St. John, and the Van Dyck portrait of Franz Snyder's, that was it for me. To me, if this is what humanity and civilization meant, that was it. And we went to the Metropolitan, much more diffuse. I particularly was taken on that first visit with the Renoir, Madame Charpentier and her children. After that, every year, I would say, I came to New York and stayed with my grandfather, either with my parents or by myself. I went to all of the museums, I went to the galleries in New York. I was wandering around when I was 12 and 13 years old, looking and looking and looking, and I went, of course, to the Museum of Modern Art. And again, I'm talking lived experience, that I looked at what was there, and Cézanne was there. Cézanne was also in the Frick Museum in terms of a major painting, which of the Jardin de Buffon in winter. And this major painting, for me, the major mistake The only mistake, perhaps, that the Frick Museum has made was to deaccession that painting, which now is in Minneapolis, because it was different in space, different in kind, but spiritually on the same level and the same humanity, I felt, as Piero and Van Dyck and Veronese and all the rest. So Cézanne was in my background early, but the other painters that came after him, and I should say, I think, that to me he is the last major European painter who dealt with nature. Not that chronologically he is, because Degas, Renoir, and Monet both outlived Cézanne. But the influence that these other painters had was minimal compared with what happened with Cézanne, even at the end of his own life. You have the faux, which come, I think, right out of Van Gogh and Gauguin in their use of color. And then you have, of course, about 1905 or 6, Picasso and Braque deconstructing the human body, deconstructing objects, deconstructing space, deconstructing the whole works. That's what they took out of Cézanne. That's not what I took out of Cézanne or take out of Cézanne. What I take out of Cézanne is a connection with the nature and the larger humanity that the 20th century and modernism has specifically gone away from. So as a boy, at let's say 11 or 12, starting with my first visits to the Modern Museum, I felt that this was art on a lesser level. It never satisfied me. It was bits and pieces that never came together in a whole. It was always limited in reference to what art could be and could do and had done in a lived way for me.